It began with noise, not the triumphant roar of engines in formation, but the peculiar metallic complaining of a machine burdened beyond its birthright. A Republic Aviation engineer stood beneath the wing and listened as if the air itself were telling him a secret. He had come to test speed, stability, the limits every aircraft is meant to keep, and what he heard instead was the possibility of violence, concentrated, precise, and terrifyingly intimate. Could a fighter do what a bomber had always done? Could a single plane, designed to dogfight and to survive, become the instrument of concentrated destruction that changed ground warfare? They called the aircraft the Thunderbolt. They would in time call it the Jug. It was broad-shouldered, almost ungainly by contemporary standards, a husk of a fighter built around a piston as massive as a locomotive, a Pratt & Whitney radial that spun like a heart. Pilots loved it because it could take the sort of punishment that killed other machines. Mechanics favored it because its strength invited improvisation. And an engineer named Alexander Kartveli, a man of patient curiosity and an appetite for practical invention, saw something in that strength no one else had prioritized: a platform. What happens when a machine is supposed to be one thing, a guardian of the skies, and a quiet mind decides it might be something else? What happens when invention outruns doctrine? The question would not be rhetorical for long. At Republic's factory, the Thunderbolt began as a promise: speed and survivability, a fighter that could go into the teeth of an enemy and come out with its metal battered but its pilot alive. The war, however, had a way of demanding more of its tools than their designers ever intended. Frontline commanders asked for more altitude, more range, more firepower. Ground troops asked for closer help, for steel and explosives that could turn a tank's flank into a ruin. And the engineer under the wing, listening to that peculiar complaint in the airframe, began to imagine a different calculus: not how the P-47 could fight the Messerschmitt, but how it could carry the thunder of ordnance and put it down where men lived and fought. He did not set out to break orthodoxy. He set out to measure. He clipped on a mount and added weight, then more weight, then little experimental racks. He counted how much the landing gear tolerated, gauged how much the wing spars could bear. He watched a propeller strain and the cowl vibrate and computed, in the cool arithmetic of an engineer, where the plane's limits met the question of effect. Could the Thunderbolt carry bombs? Yes. Could it carry many? Perhaps more than anyone expected. And in those early trials, a private exhilaration spread among a small circle. They had found a way to turn a fighter into a precise delivery system for explosives. Why did this matter? Because the battlefield in Europe was changing. The strategic raids of high-altitude bombers, long, lethal, and indiscriminate in scope, were one kind of warfare. But war in Normandy, in the bocage and the hedgerows, in the close, broken country of a continent, required immediacy. Tanks blocked roads. Pillboxes anchored fields. Troops crouched behind farm walls. What the ground commanders needed was not a carpet over 100 square miles but the ability to explode the things that mattered in the place where they mattered. That demand was a crack in doctrine that a machine with a heavy engine and a stout wing could exploit. The tests moved from the factory to the range. Kartveli watched as pilots strapped into cockpits already familiar with life-or-death improvisation and took off with external racks full of ordnance. They returned with holes and with reports that read like field notes of a new species. The Thunderbolt delivered concentrated energy at short range with a speed and accuracy that changed the tempo of support. A single Thunderbolt, in a well-executed run, could put down more immediate, focused ordnance on a target than a heavy bomber could within the same window of time and geography. Not because it carried the mass of explosives AB-17 stored internally, but because it could deliver its external load with surgical immediacy, insistence, and repeatability over a narrow area. The engineer's arithmetic had become doctrine in miniature. And yet the transformation was not merely technical. It was moral. To put a fighter into the role of punishment, to arm a plane meant to pick fights in the air with the instruments of ground devastation, was to blur the line between the distant calculus of strategic bombing and the intimate terror of close support. Pilots who had measured their heroism in maneuvers now measured it in how well they could aim a rocket or find the seam in a tank's armor. Engineers who had revered aerodynamic purity now celebrated load-bearing points. The warship of the sky had become a gunship. The language of design began to include terms like bunker buster and tank slayer. How do you reconcile the clean mind of creation with the messy ethics of destruction? How do you reconcile genius with the imperative to save your own side at any price? These questions threaded through the hangars and briefing rooms like smoke. Word of the Thunderbolt's new appetite moved like a rumor at first, then like an order. Commanders in the European theater took note. A plane that could fly fast, take punishment, and come back with the capacity to render a German column immobile on a given morning was suddenly irresistible. Training changed. Squadrons retooled their tactics. The Thunderbolt, once the pride of a design bureau, became a weaponized necessity for armies pushing through hedgerows, across bridges into towns. The transformation was not clean. There were skeptics who saw the idea as an improvisation born of pressure, not principle. There were accidents. Overloaded planes with stripped performance, pilots who miscalculated approaches and paid with lives, mechanics who learned the toll of stress on airframes the hard way. But the successes were dramatic. An armored column stopped cold by a run of rockets. A fortified farmhouse shattered by repeated low-level strafing and bomb runs. Close air support that arrived precisely when the infantry needed it. The Thunderbolt did not replace the bomber. It reframed the fight. And underneath all this, in a small office with blueprints pinned to the wall, Alexander Kartveli, patient, deliberate, a man whose answers were rarely poetic, kept returning to one thought: machines tell you what they are when you listen. He had listened to the Thunderbolt and it had answered, not in words but in load-bearing data, in strained spars, in a wing that would not buckle under a weight other fighters could not carry. The discovery was humble in its origin and immense in its consequence. A fighter, when rethought, could carry thunder. What would this mean for the soldiers on the ground, for the pilots in the air, for the engineers back at the works? Would the battlefield become a place where precision extinguished mobility, where a single aircraft made a whole armored brigade reconsider its movement? Would the Thunderbolt's new identity be a salvation or a deeper turn into mechanized brutality? These were not theoretical questions. They were answered in the mud and the smoke of Normandy, in the shattered tanks of the Falaise Pocket, in the shattered morning of Operation Cobra. The first time a Thunderbolt squadron lowered itself into the close fight and stayed long enough, low enough, and insistent enough, the map of tactical air support changed. Tactical commanders began to factor in the possibility that the sky could intervene with a level of immediacy previously reserved for artillery. Pilots learned to fly the line between support and exposure. They learned how to angle their drops so that a bomb shock did not endanger their own troops. They learned the anatomy of a tank's belly and the vulnerability of its gun mantlet. And as the 1944 campaigns unfolded, the Thunderbolt's reputation hardened into legend. Soldiers who survived a day under its protective thunder wrote letters home describing a sky that attacked not with the distant fury of a strategic raid but with the intimate, directional force of a fist. Veterans would later recall how the Jug's arrival on a field felt like a promise. We can make the enemy stop. The engineer who had listened to the plane's complaints had not only redesigned hardware, he had altered expectation. He had taught commanders to think in minutes instead of hours, in passes instead of long bombardments. But transformation is never without cost. To arm a fighter so heavily was to accept limits on range and maneuver. It was to trade aerial agility for ground effect. It was to force pilots into low-level work that exposed them to flak, to ground fire, to the small arms that catch an aircraft when it is near enough to see faces. The Thunderbolt's strength, its heavy engine and plated fuselage, made it survivable, but survivability is not invincibility. Still, the theater kept asking and the Thunderbolt kept answering. In the months that would follow, as armies pushed inland and confronted fortified positions they could not simply bypass, the question Kartveli and his colleagues had turned into engineering would become one of the decisive factors of Allied success. The machine had not simply found a second life. It had found a purpose that matched the war's mutation into a close, mechanized hell. And before the next operation, as pilots filed into briefing rooms and ground commanders pinched their maps, one question hovered in the cold air: had the war made the Thunderbolt, or had the Thunderbolt, by its very existence, made a new kind of war possible? By mid-1944, Europe had become a continent of smoke and moving lines. The Allied front was crawling east, slow and brutal, measured not in miles but in hedgerows cleared, bridges seized and towns reduced to rubble. Every advance was bought with time, blood and steel. And overhead, the air belonged to the Thunderbolt. It wasn't born a legend. It became one through repetition. Mission after mission, pilot after pilot, proving that a fighter could bear the weight of a bomber's responsibility and still come home. The P-47D, once dismissed as overbuilt and overweight, had become the workhorse of tactical air power. It carried rockets, bombs, bullets, and the moral burden of proximity. Alexander Kartvel's desk, stacked with flight reports and maintenance logs, became a kind of confessional booth for a warplane's second identity. His engineers brought back metal fragments from the field, cracked braces, scorched panels, scorched prop tips. Every scar told him two things: the aircraft could endure, and therefore the pilots could ask for more. He hadn't meant to give birth to a bomber. He had meant to give the United States a guardian of the skies, a shield against the Luftwaffe. But the shield had teeth now, and those teeth were reshaping the battlefield. Kartvel's mind turned restless. Could the airframe carry 2,500 pounds? What about 3,000? Could the wings accept the new zero-length rocket rails without compromising the lift ratio? Numbers answered him faster than conscience could. He once remarked to a colleague, "The airplane doesn't care what we call it, only what we make it do." It was a cold truth and perhaps a necessary one. The 9th Air Force had begun to test that truth over Normandy. When the Allies broke out from the beachhead after D-Day, their armored columns quickly found themselves strangled by the maze of French countryside, narrow roads, ambushes, and concealed guns. It was the perfect environment for the Thunderbolt's reinvention. A single flight could dive out of the morning haze, drop a pair of 500-pound bombs, fire a dozen rockets, strafe a convoy, and climb back into cloud cover before German flak could adjust. Infantrymen began to recognize the deep engine note that preceded salvation. They nicknamed it the Hammer of God. Was it heroism or just physics, when one man in an aluminum shell could decide the fate of hundreds below? Could technology born of cold equations acquire a soul through use? Pilots like Robert S. Johnson, Francis Gabby Gabreski, and Hubert Zenke embodied that paradox. They were hunters by training, killers of aircraft. Yet by 1944, many of their sorties ended not in aerial duels but in precise assaults on bridges, trains, and tanks. Gabreski once said that the P-47 could take anything you throw at it, and then throw it right back. To those who flew it, the plane felt less like a machine than a personal promise. You might get hit, you might catch fire, but this juggernaut of steel would get you home. It had 8.50 caliber guns, each a line of fire long enough to melt the armor off a Panzer IV. It could dive at 500 miles per hour and recover where lighter aircraft disintegrated. On the ground, the engineers pushed even further. The Republic team experimented with asymmetrical loads, external tanks, and modified pylons to push endurance beyond reason. Some tests bordered on reckless, bolts shearing under stress, engines overheating from drag. Yet in wartime, recklessness was only another form of urgency. The transformation reached its public confirmation during Operation Cobra, July 1944. The breakout from Normandy depended on shattering German resistance around Saint-Lô. The skies filled with aircraft, but above the smoke and confusion, the Thunderbolts were the ones flying low, tracing the line between salvation and disaster. They dropped fragmentation bombs within a stone's throw of friendly troops, their pilots sweating behind canopies fogged with cordite and fear. Many came back shaking, their faces streaked with grime, their voices hoarse. Some didn't come back at all. But when the ground troops advanced that evening, they found enemy armor burned out, anti-tank positions silenced, crossroads cleared. The Thunderbolt had delivered something new, the immediacy of heavy firepower controlled by eyesight, by instinct, by one man's nerve. It was no longer simply close air support. It was intimate destruction. How close can technology come to the human will before it becomes indistinguishable from it? When a man aims a bomb by the line of his heartbeat, who is the weapon, the pilot or the plane? Kartveli followed the reports with quiet fascination. The load capacity test had proven true. In short-range missions, the P-47 could carry a greater bomb weight than the four-engine B-17, not because of total volume but because of efficiency. Every pound delivered where it mattered, without the long flight across defended skies. In the arithmetic of war, that precision mattered more than abundance. The Thunderbolt had become, paradoxically, the more practical bomber. But success brings its own consequences. High command began demanding more sorties, faster turnarounds, heavier payloads. Crews worked through the night, refueling, rearming, patching bullet holes with rivets and faith. The Jug became an industrial miracle on a loop. Damage, repair, return, repeat. It wasn't glamorous work. It was persistence made of steel and sweat. On cold mornings in France, the airfields echoed with the staccato bark of radial engines coughing to life. Mechanics wiped oil from their hands and patted the fuselages like men greeting old friends. Pilots climbed in, many with Lucky Charms hanging from dials, letters tucked behind photographs. They didn't talk about fear, they talked about routine. But beneath that routine was something close to superstition. If the Jug could survive, so could they. Across the channel at Republic's plant in Farmingdale, the production lines roared like assembly hymns. Each new variant carried the evidence of frontline evolution: stronger pylons, heavier mounts, thicker armor around the cockpit. Cartvelli walked those lines silently, inspecting, adjusting, listening. Workers often found his questions strange. How does the sound change when the panel fits too tight? How does the vibration feel when the bolts strain? He was still the man who listened to machines until they confessed what they could do. One afternoon, an engineer approached him with a piece of twisted metal from a recovered wreck. "She took a direct hit," the man said, "and the pilot still made it home." Cartvelli turned the fragment over in his hand and simply said, "Then she did her job." The legend spread faster than orders could keep up. Soldiers began painting Thunderbolts and cartoon jugs on the noses. Ground crews named planes after lovers, after whiskey brands, after jokes only they understood. Each machine became personal, almost human. The more they loaded them down, the more affection they seemed to feel. Perhaps it was gratitude for surviving what logic said should be impossible. By the time the Allies reached the Siegfried Line, the Thunderbolt had rewritten the very notion of air dominance. No longer just a contest of altitude and maneuver, it was a test of endurance, of repeated violence turned into discipline. The Luftwaffe was crumbling, but German armor and artillery still bled the advancing forces. That's when the P-47s truly earned their title as tankbusters. Pilots dove through sheets of flak, their sights locked on the black dots below. Rockets streaked, bombs fell, and sometimes the concussion of their own explosions rattled their instruments. It was said you could feel the air thicken when a Thunderbolt passed overhead, a weight in the chest that told every soldier which side commanded the sky. And yet the price was staggering. Dozens of aircraft lost to ground fire every week, not from lack of courage but from sheer statistical inevitability. Pilots learned to fly through their own shrapnel, to ignore warning lights, to land with smoke trailing from engines and holes you could see daylight through. They counted survival in missions, not in months. Cartvelli's name began circulating through military channels as the man who had built the bomber that thought it was a fighter. He never corrected them. To him it was simpler. Necessity had changed the machine's destiny. If war demanded a hybrid, then engineering had done its moral duty by providing one. The press caught up to the story after the liberation of Paris. Newspapers printed photographs of Thunderbolts taxiing past cheering crowds, reporters calling them flying anvils, or stormbringers. Back home, factory workers read those words and understood that every rivet they'd driven had found its way into history. And through all of it, the question persisted, the one that no headline could answer. Was this transformation a testament to innovation or a symptom of desperation? When war ends, do such inventions return to peace, or do they linger, waiting for the next reason to exist? By winter, the Thunderbolt's shadow stretched all the way into the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge erupted like a wound reopening, and once again the Jug was called to act as both sword and shield. Pilots flew in near-zero visibility, their canopies iced, their altimeters unreliable. They dropped through cloud layers into maelstrom of smoke and tracer fire, sometimes unable to tell friend from foe until the last second. Yet again the Jug endured. When the fog lifted and the counterattack faltered, tank crews later testified, "It wasn't the weather that stopped us. It was the Thunderbolts." Back in his office, Cartvelli stared at the casualty charts and production graphs that seemed to mirror each other. For every loss, another plane rolled off the line. For every destroyed tank, another was forged somewhere in Germany. Progress, destruction, replacement, a circle without music, only rhythm. What does innovation mean when it must constantly rebuild what it annihilates? He closed the folder, turned off his desk lamp, and stepped outside into the cold night air of Long Island. Somewhere in the dark distance, he could hear engines from the test field, one more Thunderbolt proving its worth. The sound was mechanical, yes, but to him it sounded like survival. And survival, he knew, had its own kind of morality. Before we continue, if you've stayed with this story, the story of a machine that defied its design and of the men who followed it into fire, subscribe to the channel. Not for numbers, but to keep this history alive. Because the past only stays silent when no one listens. Now the war is moving east toward the Rhine, toward the heart of a dying empire. And the Thunderbolt, the accidental bomber, is about to show the world what happens when necessity turns invention into destiny. Would the machine survive peace as well as it survived war? Or would its thunder fade the moment silence returned? The answer lay in the next campaign. The winter of 1945 was not a season, it was a crucible. The Rhine lay ahead, a wide, gray artery of history that separated the exhausted Allies from the decaying heart of the Reich. Snow choked the roads, rivers froze at their edges, and the air was thick with the smell of fuel and resignation. The Luftwaffe was dying, but it was still dangerous. Its jets appeared like ghosts, Me-262 streaking across the sky faster than propellers could turn. And against this desperate modernity, the Thunderbolt, heavy and loud, continued to rise. In the war's final months, the P-47 was no longer just a fighter or a bomber. It was a statement of persistence, the will of engineering to adapt faster than destruction could consume. Ground troops called them angels, iron angels perhaps, but angels nonetheless. For the German soldiers who saw them descend, they were omens. The sound of the Thunderbolt meant that movement was suicide. Over the frozen fields of the Ardennes, the 56th Fighter Group flew mission after mission. Their orders were simple: choke the German retreat. Rail lines, convoys, bridges, anything that moved became a target. The Jug's thick armor allowed pilots to dive into anti-aircraft zones others would avoid. And when they pulled up, climbing through tracer fire, they often brought back more than smoke. They brought back proof that the line between fighter and bomber no longer existed. Alexander Kartveli watched the war from across an ocean, yet every telegram that reached his desk carried the weight of what his machine had become. Thunderbolt destroyed 12 tanks in one run. Thunderbolt lost with pilot Kia, cause unknown. The messages read like alternating prayers and obituaries. Progress reports written in fire. He was a man of numbers, not sentiment. But even he understood what those reports meant. His creation had become indispensable. A tool so efficient it was now tied to human survival. And perhaps, in the quiet hours before dawn, he also wondered if such necessity came with a debt. In February 1945, Allied intelligence began preparing for Operation Lumberjack, the push to the Rhine. Armored divisions would advance rapidly, but they would need protection from ambushes and from the scattered remnants of German armor. The Thunderbolt, fitted with twin 1,000-pound bombs and 10 5-inch rockets, was now officially a ground attack weapon. A fighter in name only. Pilots flew low enough to see the faces of men below them, to smell the cordite of their own rockets. "You weren't bombing a target anymore," one pilot said. "You were bombing a man with a rifle who just happened to be in your way." They had traded the anonymity of altitude for the intimacy of combat. Could there be valor in proximity? Could killing face-to-face be more merciful than killing from a distance? The juggernauts roared eastward. On the morning of March 1st, a formation of Thunderbolts from the 405th Fighter Group strafed a German column near Remagen. What they found there would enter legend: an intact bridge spanning the Rhine, the Ludendorff Bridge, the last gateway into the German heartland. The pilots radioed back immediately, their voices sharp with disbelief. "The bridge is still standing." Within hours, Allied armor was rolling across it. The Thunderbolts were called to guard the crossing, diving again and again to suppress artillery and destroy counterattacks. Some flew 5-6 sorties a day. They bombed tanks, trains, even the approaches to the bridge itself to keep the Germans from reaching it. The sky over Remagen became a blackened halo of smoke and steel. For 3 days, Kartveli's creation played its part in one of the war's final miracles. The Rhine was breached, not by bombers, not by paratroopers, but by the persistence of ground troops protected by fighter bombers born from an engineer's curiosity. The P-47 had helped finish what the B-17s had begun. Was it fate? Or the inevitable conclusion of an idea that began with a question under a wing? When word of the crossing reached Washington, the newspapers hailed the Thunderbolt as the war's workhorse. It was not glamorous. It did not possess the elegance of a Spitfire, nor the myth of the Mustang. But in every theater, Europe, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, it had proven one unshakable truth: victory often belongs to the machine that refuses to die. Pilots began personalizing their planes more than ever. Names painted in white across the olive-drab fuselage: Lucky Lady, Jug Hauler, Miss Fireball. Each name was both affection and defiance. They had seen what the Jug could endure: holes the size of fists punched through its wings, oil leaking like blood, control cables shredded, yet somehow the plane flew home. It was as if the Thunderbolt's heart, that massive R-2800 engine, refused to stop beating. To understand how extraordinary that engine was, you had to hear it up close. It wasn't the clean whine of a Merlin or the tidy hum of a radial half its size. It was a thunderclap repeating 2,500 times a minute, a mechanical heartbeat that shook the ground. Even when idling, it sounded impatient, as though the aircraft itself knew it was meant to be in motion. When Carvelli designed it, he had demanded one thing above all else: strength. Not beauty, not grace, but the raw ability to survive. "Build me a fighter," he had said, "that a man can bring home even when he shouldn't." That design philosophy, born of practicality, became prophecy. In late March, the Allied push toward the Ruhr Valley intensified. The German army was collapsing, but its defenses were stubborn. Towns became fortresses, each street a battle. The Thunderbolt's missions grew shorter, denser, more violent. There was no time for high-altitude elegance. These were knife fights from the sky. Some pilots described the sensation of flying through their own explosions, fragments of their own rockets spinning past the canopy, smoke swallowing their visibility. Others compared it to standing on the edge of a volcano. Yet they returned again and again. The Jug could take the hits, and so could the men who flew it. In these final battles, the Thunderbolt became something more than a plane. It became the sound of inevitability. When German soldiers heard that deep growl overhead, they froze. Veterans of the Eastern Front said it reminded them of artillery, unstoppable, methodical, absolute. There was no escape from the sky. Even the civilians knew its song. Survivors from Cologne, Essen, and Kassel would later say the same thing. "When we heard the low roar, we knew the Americans were close." For some, it meant terror, for others, liberation. The engineers back in Farmingdale began working on the next iteration, the P-47N, with longer wings, greater range, and improved bomb capacity for the Pacific War. But Carvelli was already thinking beyond the piston. Jet engines were arriving. Propellers were becoming relics. He knew the Thunderbolt's reign would end not in defeat, but in obsolescence. The thought unsettled him more than he expected. Had he created the perfect machine just in time for it to become history? He visited one of the training airfields that spring. The war in Europe was almost over. Rows of Thunderbolts lined the tarmac, their olive paint dulled by dust. Young pilots climbed in and out, learning the rhythms of takeoff, the angles of dive, the math of survival. Carvelli watched them from the edge of the runway. They were boys, barely 20, trusting their lives to his equations. One of them saluted him awkwardly, not knowing who he was. "Nice machine, sir," the boy said. Carvelli nodded. "Take care of her," he replied, "and she'll take care of you." The boy grinned, pulled down his goggles, and vanished into the sky. That moment, he later told a colleague, was when he realized the Thunderbolt was no longer his. It belonged to those who flew it, those who depended on it, those who feared it. The machine had entered the human story. When Germany finally collapsed in May, the Thunderbolts flew victory passes over ruined cities. Their wings glinted in the morning light, and for the first time in years, the sound of their engines was not followed by explosions. Soldiers on the ground looked up, unsure whether to cheer or simply listen. The sky that had once brought death now carried silence in motion. And yet, for many pilots, peace was disorienting. They had spent years defining their lives by missions, by targets, by the roar of the Jug beneath them. Without war, who were they? One veteran wrote, "The silence after the last flight was louder than the noise ever was." Back at Republic, production slowed. Victory posters replaced casualty lists. Carvelli's staff celebrated, but he could not shake the unease. The machine had done its work. It had saved countless lives and ended countless others. In his notebooks, among the technical drawings and stress calculations, he scribbled a single line. The Thunderbolt answered every question except the one that mattered: why? History would call him a visionary, a pioneer. But in the quiet of his later years, he carried something closer to guilt. Not regret. He had done what necessity demanded, but the awareness that invention has no conscience of its own. It only reflects the urgency of the time. Even so, when veterans visited him, when they shook his hand and told him the Jug had brought them home, his eyes softened. That, he would say, was all it ever meant to do. The war in Europe was over. But far across the Pacific, another horizon was waiting, islands fortified in coral and fire, where the Jug would once again find purpose. From the Philippines to Okinawa, the P-47 would meet the enemy not as a fighter chasing another plane, but as a deliverer of precision and devastation. War had taught the Thunderbolt to change. Peace would soon ask if it could remember how. Before we cross the ocean with it, before we watch its thunder roll over another continent, take a second. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Because what comes next is more than history, it's the echo of invention meeting consequence. And you'll want to hear how the thunder finally fades. The Pacific waited, and the sky was not done with the P-47 yet. The Pacific was a different kind of hell, wide, endless, and bright. Where Europe's war had been fought in smoke and mud, the Pacific's was fought in heat and light, across islands that seemed too small to justify the blood they consumed. The ocean was the battlefield, but the air was the weapon. By late 1944, the United States was preparing for its final push across the Pacific chain. The Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond. The P-47 Thunderbolt, already hardened by Europe's brutality, was called across the ocean to serve again. But here, the distances were greater, the heat unforgiving, and the enemy fanatically unwilling to surrender. The engineers at Republic had foreseen this. They had built the P-47N, longer wings, greater range, more fuel, more endurance. It was the largest, heaviest single-seat piston-engine fighter America would ever fly. If the European Jug had been a hammer, this was a cathedral bell, deep, resonant, unstoppable. On the ground, Cartvelli's team tested the N model against tropical extremes. Metal warped in the heat, engines ran hotter, oil pressure spiked in the humidity. But the aircraft still performed. It wasn't elegant, but it was indestructible. Its sheer mass made it a survivor. And in the Pacific, survival was everything. When the Thunderbolts arrived on the island of Saipan, they were greeted by a landscape of wreckage, broken aircraft, rusted tanks, and the smell of burned coral. The new squadrons would have to operate from hastily built airstrips carved into volcanic rock. Mechanics worked barefoot in the sand. Pilots slept under their wings. Every day the war drew closer to Japan, and every day the Thunderbolt carried heavier loads into the storm. The first missions against the Philippines proved what Cartvelli had always known. Strength was a weapon in itself. The Jug's thick armor shrugged off flak bursts that tore lighter planes apart. Its engine could lose cylinders and still deliver enough power to bring a man home. "She just won't quit," one pilot said. "You can shoot at her, burn her, break her, but she just keeps flying." The Thunderbolt's role had changed again. No longer just a bomber hunter or tank buster, it became the spearhead of island warfare, blasting supply depots, strafing convoys, obliterating artillery nests hidden in jungles. Its sound became as feared in the Pacific as it had been in France. And its reputation spread among friend and foe alike. But the enemy here was different. The Japanese fought not for ground but for honor. They dug deep, waited in silence, and fought to the last man. 4 pilots flying the Jug, every mission meant diving through curtains of anti-aircraft fire onto targets invisible until the last second. Sometimes the only clue was a flicker of muzzle flash beneath the palm trees. They carried napalm now, canisters that turned jungles into sheets of flame. Pilots described the aftermath in terms that never left them. The sky blackened, the ground seething, the smell of burning oil and vegetation merging into something unspeakable. It was war reduced to chemistry. Cartvelli received the reports but seldom commented. He was older now, grayer, his once restless curiosity replaced by quiet fatigue. When a young journalist asked him how it felt to see his aircraft burn through the Pacific like a second sun, he paused for a long moment and said, "It was built to bring men home. That's still what I hope it's doing." By early 1945, the Thunderbolt's legend reached the Marianas, then Okinawa. Here the stakes were apocalyptic. Japan's defenses were layered, relentless, and suicidal. Kamikazes filled the skies, turning every flight into a duel between endurance and fanaticism. The Thunderbolt, though slower than the new Mustangs, became a defensive wall for the fleet, intercepting attackers before they could reach the ships. It was not glamorous work. It was exhausting, dirty, and endless. The P-47N flew long escort missions for the bombers striking the Japanese mainland, B-29s carrying destruction on an industrial scale. But when the weather turned or the formation broke, The Jug's pilots often found themselves alone, guiding the giants through storms, or diving to strafe airfields that might rise against them. And once again the line blurred. The fighter was now the protector of the bombers that had once overshadowed it. The circle had closed. There is a strange poetry in how machines evolve beyond their maker's intentions. The P-47 began as a response to fear of being outgunned, outflown, outbuilt. But it ended as a symbol of dominance, a living testament to how necessity breeds invention. It was the child of crisis and it grew into power. As the Allies drew closer to Japan, the Thunderbolt's presence became constant. Over Okinawa, the sky was a perpetual roar. Pilots flew 6, sometimes 7 missions a day. Fuel ran low, tempers shorter. Ground crews worked in mud that reeked of oil and sweat. The airstrips were littered with shrapnel and craters, repaired and destroyed in the same hour. And still the Thunderbolts rose. When Japanese tanks tried to break through the southern line, it was the Jugs that stopped them, swooping down in pairs, releasing bombs so close the shockwaves nearly flipped them over. The aftermath was always the same: burning metal, silence, the faint hiss of cooling steel. Was this victory or exhaustion with another name? When survival becomes routine, what happens to the meaning of triumph? In June 1945, after months of brutal attrition, Okinawa fell. It was the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific, and the Thunderbolt had been there for every moment of it, from the first bombardments to the last desperate counterattacks. Pilots wept openly when it was over. Not from joy but from emptiness. They had survived what many had called impossible. And yet, the cost was beyond comprehension. Then, in August, the war changed forever. Hiroshima. Nagasaki. 2 flashes of light that rendered all previous definitions of power obsolete. The era of piston engines, propellers, and incremental improvements ended in a heartbeat. The Jug was suddenly a relic, a masterpiece made irrelevant by a new kind of thunder. When the news reached Carvelli, he said nothing. Those around him recalled that he sat for hours at his desk, staring at a photograph of a P-47 on a runway. "We built the Thunder," he finally said. But the lightning came from somewhere else. In the months that followed, the war receded like a tide. Thunderbolts were ferried home, lined up in neat rows on quiet airfields. Some would be sold to Allied nations. Others would be scrapped, melted down into the civilian piece that had no use for armor or speed. Pilots left their names scrawled on the fuselage before walking away. Mechanics took photographs beside their machines, smiling in the sun as if trying to memorize the shape of survival. One aircraft, serial number 44 to 89505, made its final flight to Farmingdale. It had flown 162 missions, been hit 17 times, and carried 12 different pilots, all of whom survived. When it landed, the ground crews cheered, but Carvelli only touched its scarred fuselage and whispered something no one caught. Later, a journalist asked him what he'd said. He smiled faintly. "I told her she could rest now." The P-47 had carried the burden of a generation's desperation. It had outflown its enemies, outlasted its replacements, and outlived its own design. But in doing so, it had taught the world something about resilience, and about cost. Can a machine have a legacy? Or is legacy only what we project onto steel once the noise has stopped? Decades later, when historians spoke of the war's great inventions, they mentioned the atomic bomb, radar, the jet engine. But the Thunderbolt belonged to another kind of memory, the human scale of invention. The courage of the mechanic tightening bolts under fire, the engineer listening to stress in the wings, the pilot trusting his life to physics and chance. His story was not just about firepower. It was about willpower. When veterans met at reunions years after the war, they would raise their glasses and toast the Jug. Some would laugh, some would cry. One old pilot summed it up best: "We didn't fly her. She carried us." And so, as peace settled uneasily over the world, the Thunderbolt's sound faded from the skies but not from history. Its legacy was carved into every field it had once protected, every bridge it had destroyed, every tank it had silenced. It was the weapon that refused to be limited by definition, the fighter that became a bomber, the bomber that became a savior. Before we close this chapter, take a moment. If you're still here, still listening, subscribe to the channel. Not for algorithms but for memory. Because remembering isn't passive. It's resistance against forgetting what these machines and the people behind them stood for. In the final part of this story, we'll return to the man who started it all, Alexander Carvelli, and to a post-war world that no longer needed his Thunderbolt, but could never escape its echo. The war was over. But the thunder was not done rolling yet. The war ended not with silence, but with disorientation. The world exhaled, but no one quite knew what peace sounded like anymore. For 6 years, the rhythm of life had been engines, sirens, gunfire, and thunder. When those sounds vanished, the quiet felt unnatural, like the pause between heartbeats when you're not sure if another one will come. In that strange stillness, the Thunderbolt, once the loudest voice in the sky, became a relic. Airfields across America filled with rows of machines that had no more enemies to kill. Their paint faded in the sun. Their tires deflated. Birds nested in their gun ports. Some were sold to foreign allies for pennies on the dollar. Others were scrapped for aluminum, melted back into the anonymity of peace. For Alexander Kartveli, it was an ending that felt both victorious and hollow. The machine that had defined his life now sat dormant, its story complete. Or so it seemed. He walked the empty hangars at Republic Aviation, running his hand across wings still warm from the sun, and wondered if the world would ever need a plane like this again. He was a man of creation, but creation had never been kind to its creators. There was always something newer, faster, more ruthless on the horizon. Jet engines were emerging. The P-80 shooting star had already proven what the future would sound like, a high, clean scream that made piston thunder seem ancient. And yet, there was something in that old roar that refused to die. The Thunderbolt had become a symbol, not of modernity but of endurance. It represented the kind of strength that could not be replaced by speed. It was, in its way, human. Kartveli's next years were spent in quiet labor. He began designing the Republic F-84, a jet that would carry forward the same philosophy of survivability and power that defined the P-47. But it was never the same. The F-84 was faster, sleeker, yet it lacked the elemental soul of the Jug. The sound of the radial engine, the weight of armor, the feeling that you could take a hit and keep going, those belonged to another era. He kept a photograph on his desk, a pilot standing beside a battered P-47, its skin torn, its nose scorched. The caption read, "She brought me home." That, Kartveli often said, was all the design ever meant to achieve. For the men who flew her, peace was not simple either. Many returned home to a country that celebrated victory but could not understand what it had cost them. They took jobs, raised families, and tried to forget the sound of flak bursting near their wings. But sometimes, when thunder rolled across the horizon, they would stop, look up, and for an instant feel that same instinct, that the sky was calling. The Thunderbolt's post-war life was fragmented. Some served in foreign air forces, France, Mexico, Brazil, even the newly formed NATO allies. They flew through the early Cold War years, outdated but dependable, carrying the ghosts of another conflict into a new one. In Latin America, farmers and villagers would look up and see the silhouette of the old Jug, still flying patrols decades after its birth, its engine rumbling like a memory that refused to fade. Historians would later debate its legacy. Was the P-47 the best fighter of the war? The deadliest? The most overbuilt? But those arguments missed the point. Its greatness was not measured in statistics. It was measured in trust. Trust between man and machine. Trust that when everything else failed, something made of metal and mathematics could still bring you home alive. One veteran, decades later, described his last mission in Europe. His squadron had been tasked with destroying a German train convoy. They dived, released their bombs, and climbed back through flak so thick it looked like smoke clouds made of steel. His engine took a hit. Oil pressure dropped to zero. The canopy filled with smoke. He thought it was over. But the Jug didn't quit. "She climbed," he said, "like she knew I still had one more sunrise left in me." Stories like that were never rare. They became legend, the kind of stories that outlived data sheets and blueprints. And in those stories, the P-47 transcended its purpose. It became not just a tool of war, but a metaphor for resilience. Kartveli attended a reunion in 1953. He was older, slower, his hands shaking slightly when he lifted his glass. Around him were men who had once been boys, pilots, mechanics, engineers. They laughed, told old stories, exaggerated dogfights, and remembered names of friends who never came home. When the toast came, one of the pilots raised his glass and said, "To the man who built our guardian angel." Kartveli smiled, but his eyes were distant. Later that night, someone asked him if he ever thought about the people his creation had killed. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said quietly, "Every invention carries two shadows, the one it saves and the one it ends. You can't separate them. You just hope you're standing in the right one." That was the burden of genius in an age of war, to know that progress and destruction shared the same blueprint. By the 1960s, jet fighters ruled the sky. The Thunderbolt belonged to museums and airshows. Children pressed their faces against glass to stare at it, their reflections merging with the worn metal of its fuselage. To them it was ancient, a relic from a black and white world. But for those who had lived through it, that sound could never truly fade. And then, in a strange twist of history, the name returned. Republic's new design, the A-10, born decades later, would inherit not just the company's lineage but the Thunderbolt spirit. They called it the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a deliberate echo. Heavily armored, brutally effective, built around a single massive engine and a gun instead of bombs. It was the same philosophy reborn: survivability first, elegance second. When the A-10 rolled out in the 1970s, journalists asked the old engineers if they saw the resemblance. "It's the same heart," one said. "Different century, same soul." If the P-47 was thunder, the A-10 was the echo, proof that ideas never truly die, they just evolve into new forms. Cartvelli didn't live to see the A-10 fly, but his fingerprints were in its every rivet, every philosophy, every refusal to compromise on strength. In that sense, the Thunderbolt never ended. It only changed shape. As time passed, the few surviving P-47s found homes in museums and private collections. Restorers spent years bringing them back to life, polishing their metal until it shone again. When their engines started for the first time in decades, crowds fell silent. The sound was unmistakable, deep, raw, alive. It was not nostalgia. It was recognition. Somewhere between that first cough of the engine and the rising rumble, history breathed again. And for a brief moment, everyone who heard it understood why the men who built and flew these machines could never truly let them go. Because that sound, that thunder, was not just mechanical. It was human. So what was the P-47 in the end? A bomber? A fighter? A mistake that became a masterpiece? Maybe all of them. Maybe that's the point. It was proof that evolution in war is not a choice but a reaction, that innovation often begins as an accident, and that accidents can change the world. The man under the wing, the one who first listened to the airframe and heard possibility, never intended to create a bomber. He only wanted to understand the limits of what existed. And by listening closely enough, he helped those limits disappear. The Thunderbolt became the paradox of its time, the machine too heavy to fly, yet too strong to fall. It was born of caution and forged in chaos. It fought not for glory but for necessity. And somehow, in that necessity, it found immortality. Today, when one of those surviving P-47s takes off at an airshow, you can still feel it. The deep vibration in your chest, the kind that makes you instinctively look up. People raise their phones, but the sound overwhelms the moment. The crowd doesn't cheer right away. They listen. They feel it. That's not nostalgia. That's recognition, the echo of a century that learned how to wield thunder and still survive it. And maybe that's what history is, a long echo fading into silence, carried by those who refuse to forget. If you've stayed until now, you've heard the full story, the story of a machine that wasn't meant to change history but did. The story of the engineer who listened to steel and found a voice inside it. The story of how, in the darkest war, thunder itself learned to carry bombs. If that story moved you, subscribe. Not for content, for remembrance. Because every view, every comment, every word shared keeps the thunder alive just a little longer. And when the next storm rolls across the sky and you hear that deep, rolling sound in the distance, remember, once long ago men built thunder with their own hands. And it flew.